The ballroom had the kind of silence that only happens when something impossible walks through the door. Elias Carter wore no designer suit, carried no name worth dropping, and knew no one in the room. But the moment Victoria Hale turned and saw his face, every conversation stopped. Every glass held still. Because standing across the marble floor was a man who looked exactly like her, same jaw, same eyes, same everything. Two strangers. Two completely different lives. One face that made an entire room forget what it had been doing, and no one could explain why. Elias Carter did not belong here, and he knew it the moment the valet looked at his jacket. It was clean pressed even, but it was not the kind of jacket that belonged in a ballroom with cathedral ceilings and flower arrangements that cost more than his monthly rent. He had received the invitation 3 days earlier, an unmarked envelope slipped under his apartment door with a single card inside, embossed with the Hale Foundation logo, and his name typed cleanly at the top. No explanation. No contact number. Just an address, a date, and a dress code he barely met. He almost didn't come. He had work to finish a freelance design project already 2 days past deadline, and exactly 0 reasons to walk into a room full of people who measured success in the size of their donations. But something about the invitation felt deliberate, too precise, too personal to be a clerical error. So he ironed the jacket, took the bus across town, and walked in through a side entrance, like someone who had been told he was allowed, but wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The charity gala was everything the city's elite considered a good cause, a ballroom full of people spending enormous sums of money on the appearance of generosity. Crystal chandeliers hung over a crowd dressed in fabrics that had their own names. Servers moved through the room like ghosts, carrying trays of food Elias didn't recognize. He took a glass of water from one of them, found a spot near the edge of the room, and watched. He was good at watching. It was one of the few things his quiet, understated life had made him genuinely skilled at. Victoria Hale was easy to locate. She was the center of every cluster of people in the room, the fixed point around which all conversation orbited. She was younger than most people expected when they first heard her name, early 30s, sharp-eyed, dressed in something dark and structured that made her look both powerful and untouchable. She ran Hale Technologies, a company that had grown from a mid-sized software firm into a global infrastructure giant under her leadership alone. She had been on the cover of 3 national magazines in the past 18 months, and she carried herself like someone who had long since stopped being surprised by her own success. Elias watched her work the room with the kind of controlled precision that looked effortless, but wasn't. She shook hands, smiled on cue, said the right things to the right people. And then, at some point in the middle of a conversation with a gray-haired man in a navy blue suit, she looked up the way people sometimes do when they sense something without being able to name it, and her eyes landed on Elias. She stopped mid-sentence. The gray-haired man kept talking for a moment before he noticed she was no longer listening. Victoria's expression didn't collapse into shock. It was more controlled than that. But her stillness was total, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. Elias felt the weight of her stare from across the room before he fully understood where it was coming from. He turned, found her eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the room started to notice. It happened the way these things do. One person leans toward another, whispers something, and the ripple spreads outward until the whole room is doing it. People turned to look at Elias, then at Victoria, then back again. The murmur beneath the music grew low and specific. Someone near Elias said very quietly that it had to be a coincidence. Someone else said coincidences didn't look like that. A woman in red touched her companion's arm and said nothing at all, which somehow communicated more than anything spoken. Victoria crossed the room. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without hesitation, as though the distance between her and whatever she wanted was simply a problem to be closed. She stopped in front of Elias and looked at him for a long moment, not with warmth, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of someone running calculations they hadn't expected to need. Up close, the resemblance was even harder to dismiss. Same jaw, same eyes, same way the light caught the angles of their faces. It was not subtle. It was not something that could be explained away by saying some people just look alike. Victoria spoke first. She asked him directly, and without softening it, who he was and why he was there. Elias told her his name. He told her he had received an invitation. He did not apologize for being in the room, which seemed to register with her in a way she didn't expect. She told him she had not sent that invitation personally. Her team handled the foundation's guest list, and that his name meant nothing to her. Elias said her name had not meant much to him either, until about 6 months ago, when her company's name started appearing on the news every other week. They stood there in front of a room full of people who were no longer pretending not to watch, and both of them said clearly that they didn't know each other. But the feeling underneath that statement was less certain. Elias could not explain it. Looking at Victoria Hale felt less like looking at a stranger, and more like looking at something he couldn't place a face from a photograph he'd seen once, and half forgotten, or a voice on the edge of a memory that never quite surfaced. He didn't say that. He was not the kind of man who said things like that to someone he'd just met, especially not to someone who was looking at him with the analytical distance of a person used to making decisions with incomplete information. After the gala wound down and the last of the guests began collecting their coats, a man from Victoria's team approached Elias near the exit and told him that Ms. Hale would like a few minutes of his time privately before he left. The phrasing was professional, almost bureaucratic. But Elias understood what it actually was, a request from someone who did not often make requests delivered by someone trained to make it sound optional, when it wasn't entirely. He stood at the door for a moment, weighing it. He had nothing waiting for him except a cold apartment and an unfinished project. He had no reason to stay, and every practical reason to walk out and let this strange evening become nothing more than a story he'd tell badly to no one in particular. But there was something pulling at the edge of his thinking that he couldn't dismiss, the same thing that had made him come in the first place, the same thing that made him stop and look when she looked at him. He wasn't a superstitious person. He didn't believe in signs, but he believed in questions, and this felt like one he would not be able to outrun. Elias handed his coat ticket back to the attendant and walked in the direction the man had indicated. He stayed. The room Victoria led him to was a private lounge behind the main hall, small by the building's standards, which still made it larger than Elias's living room. There was a leather sofa, a low table with a half-empty bottle of sparkling water, and 2 chairs positioned across from each other, like the setup for a meeting that hadn't been scheduled. Victoria gestured toward one of the chairs and sat in the other. She had dismissed her assistant before closing the door. Whatever this was, she wanted no witnesses. She looked at him the way she probably looked at acquisition reports, carefully, without revealing what she was thinking. She told him she was not a person who believed in coincidences. She said she needed to understand what was happening, and that the most efficient way to do that was to ask him directly. She wanted to know who had sent him the invitation, and what he was expecting to gain from being there. Elias held her gaze and said evenly that he had already answered both of those questions. He had received an invitation with no explanation he had come, because he was curious, and he was not expecting to gain anything because he hadn't known anything was available to gain. Victoria's expression didn't shift, but something behind it did. She was measuring him, not his clothes or his posture, but the specific quality of his response. Whether it was rehearsed, whether there was a version of this conversation he had already played out in his head before walking into the ballroom. Elias understood what she was doing. He was not naive about how people with power and money thought about people without it. The assumption was almost always the same, that proximity to wealth had a motive attached to it, that anyone who ended up in the same room as someone like Victoria Hale had put themselves there on purpose. He told her without raising his voice that if she had already decided he was running some kind of scheme, there was nothing he could say to change that, and he was not interested in auditioning for her trust. He stood up. Victoria said his name not warmly, but with enough precision that it stopped him. She said she was not accusing him. She said she was trying to think clearly about something that was making clear thinking difficult. That was the first honest thing she had said to him since they sat down, and they both knew it. Elias sat back down. They talked for another hour. Not about the resemblance, directly around it, cautiously, the way you circle something that might be dangerous if approached too fast. He told her what was true, that he had no family to speak of, that he had spent most of his adult life building a quiet existence out of freelance work, and very few attachments, that he had never had reason to look into his own history in any serious way, because there had never seemed to be anything there worth finding. Victoria listened without interrupting, which surprised him. She was clearly the kind of person who interrupted. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had been adopted. She said it the way someone says a fact they have made peace with, flatly, without emotion, as though it were simply a piece of data about her life, and not the most complicated thing she had ever told a stranger. She had known since she was a teenager. The Hales had never hidden it from her, or so she had believed. They had told her it was a private adoption, that her birth records were sealed, and that the people who had handled it were no longer in practice. She had never pushed further. She had a life, a company, a future. The past had seemed like something that could stay where it was. Looking at Elias Carter sitting across from her in a borrowed lounge chair, she was no longer sure the past had agreed to those terms. Victoria had a private physician she trusted completely, a man named Dr. Raymond Walsh, who had handled her medical matters with total discretion for nearly a decade. She called him the following morning. She explained the situation in the most clinical terms she could manage: two individuals with a striking physical resemblance, no known connection, and a shared interest in determining whether that resemblance had a biological basis. Dr. Walsh asked no unnecessary questions. He arranged the test for that same afternoon. Elias agreed to it. He told himself he was agreeing because it was the logical thing to do, because if the answer was no, they could both walk away with something confirmed, and if the answer was something else, then walking away without knowing would be a different kind of problem. He showed up at the private clinic on the east side of the city, gave the sample without ceremony, and left without seeing Victoria. They did not speak while they waited. There was nothing useful to say. The results came back in 4 days. Dr. Walsh delivered them to Victoria in person, which told Elias everything before anyone said a word, because Victoria called him that same evening, and her voice, which had been measured and controlled in every previous interaction, was neither of those things. She said the test was conclusive. They were full biological siblings. Elias sat with that for a long time after she said it. He was in his apartment at the small desk where he did his work, and the screen in front of him had a half-finished project open that he could no longer see. Full siblings. Not half, not distant, not some technical match that required interpretation. The same parents, the same origin point. He had spent his entire life without a single family member he could name, and now a laboratory in a private clinic on the east side of the city was telling him that one of the most powerful women in the country had the same blood running through her. Victoria was not crying when she told him, but she was not composed either. She said she needed to see him. Elias said he would come the next day. They met at her office, not the corporate headquarters, but a smaller space she kept in a building across town, away from her staff. It was the kind of place where she did the thinking she didn't want observed. When Elias arrived, she already had documents spread across the table. She had spent the 4 days of waiting, doing what she always did when confronted with something she didn't understand. She researched. What she had found was not clean. The private adoption agency that had handled her placement no longer existed. It had been dissolved almost 30 years ago quietly, with no public record of why. The attorney who had managed the paperwork had died more than a decade back. But there were financial records buried in her family's estate documentation that she had access to as sole heir. Payments made in the year of her adoption, large ones, routed through shell entities to parties whose names appeared nowhere in the formal record. The numbers were too large for routine legal fees. The routing was too careful to be incidental. Someone had paid to keep this clean. Someone had paid to make sure that whatever had existed before Victoria Hale became Victoria Hale stayed invisible. She also had one more thing. In the same stack of estate documents, she had found a letter, handwritten unsigned, tucked inside a folder of administrative records that referenced 2 placements, not 1. The language was careful, the kind of careful that exists specifically to avoid being understood by anyone who wasn't supposed to read it. But the implication was clear. There had been another arrangement, a parallel one. Someone had made sure the 2 sides of that arrangement never found each other, until 3 days ago when an unmarked envelope had arrived under Elias Carter's apartment door with his name typed cleanly at the top. Elias looked at the letter. He asked her who she thought had sent it. Victoria said she didn't know yet, but she said that whoever it was had known enough to know his name, his address, and the date of her foundation's gala. That was not public information. That was someone who had been watching and waiting and had finally decided the separation had gone on long enough. She laid the rest of the documents out for him, without framing them, just the facts and sequence, the way she would present a business problem to someone she needed to think alongside. Elias listened. He was good at listening. But as she spoke, something in him was shifting from the careful, measured curiosity of the past 4 days into something older and less manageable he had grown up without. Not dramatically, not in a way that made for a compelling story, just the steady, grinding reality of not having enough, of making do, of building a life one small decision at a time, with no one to catch him if he miscalculated. And now he was sitting across a table from a woman who had grown up with everything money, name, education, access, and learning that the separation between their 2 lives had not been an accident of fate. It had been arranged. It had been paid for. He asked her carefully whether she believed her adoptive family had known about him, specifically. Not just that she had a birth history, but that there was someone on the other side of that history who existed. Victoria looked at the documents in front of her. Then she said she didn't know. But she also said that the size of those payments and the care taken to root them suggested that whoever had made them was not simply paying for an adoption. They were paying for a guarantee. And guarantees, in her experience, were purchased when there was something specific to prevent. Elias said very quietly that what they were preventing was him. Victoria's investigators people she used for corporate due diligence and trusted absolutely spent the following 6 days pulling at the remaining threads. What they found was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was simpler than that, and worse. Arthur Hale. Victoria's adoptive father had built the early years of his company on a partnership that later became contentious. During that period, he had sought an heir through private channels, specifically through an intermediary connected to a small family that had fallen into crisis and was in no position to resist the terms being offered. A private arrangement. 1 child placed with the Hales. The other younger by several minutes, the record suggested, redirected to the foster system under a different name, with no trace of the original connection remaining. His erasure had not been incidental to Victoria's adoption. It had been a condition of it. Elias had been in foster care until he was old enough to leave it. He had known that. He had built an entire identity around not letting that fact be the most important thing about him. He had not known there was a door that had been deliberately closed before he was old enough to reach for it. When Victoria finished telling him what the investigators had found, she watched his face and did not try to fill the silence. There was nothing to fill it with. The expression on Elias's face was not anger, exactly. It was something that sat beneath anger, the kind of thing that takes years of compacted disappointment to produce. He looked at the documents on the table, and then he looked at her, and what he said next was not what she expected. He said he couldn't do this. Victoria started to speak. Elias said he wasn't finished. He told her that he understood she hadn't made the choices that had been made. He understood she was not her father, and that she had come to him with the truth instead of away from it. He understood all of that, but understanding something and being able to sit across from it were not the same thing. She was the living embodiment of everything that had been taken from him, not because she had taken it, but because it had been given to her specifically instead of him. Every resource, every opportunity, every safety net that had never existed in his life had existed in hers. And the same people, the same transaction, the same sealed documents had produced both outcomes. He couldn't look at her without feeling the full weight of that. And he was not willing to perform a reconciliation he didn't feel just because the biology said he was supposed to. Victoria did not argue. She did not offer him money. She was intelligent enough to understand what that would mean in this specific moment. She sat with what he had said, and then, because she was someone who dealt in precision, she told him one thing that she had spent her entire life believing her family's choices were hers to build on, and that she now understood those choices had a cost she had never been asked to pay. She said she didn't know what came next. She said she wasn't sure she deserved to know. Elias left. He walked out of the building past the lobby with its unmarked elegance through the door and into the ordinary noise of the street. He did not look back. Behind him, Victoria sat at the table with the documents spread in front of her, and a conclusion she had never wanted, that the empire she had spent her life building had its foundation in someone else's erasure. And the someone else had just walked out the door, and she had no idea whether he would ever come back. 3 weeks passed. Elias did not hear from Victoria, and he did not reach out. He went back to his work, his apartment, his ordinary life, the one he had built so carefully and for so long that it fit him like something worn and comfortable, in the way that things are comfortable when you've stopped noticing how small they are. He finished the overdue project. He took on 2 more. He slept poorly and told himself it was the weather. He thought about her more than he wanted to admit, not with warmth, not yet, but with the persistent, unresolved quality of something left open. He kept returning to the same sequence: the sealed documents, the shell entities, the payments large enough to buy a guarantee. He kept returning to the fact that somewhere in a records office there existed a piece of paper that had determined the entire shape of his life before he was old enough to know he had one. He had made peace with a great many things over the years. He was not sure he knew how to make peace with that. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after he had walked out of Victoria's office, a message arrived. Not from Victoria, directly from a woman named Dana Reeves, who identified herself as Victoria's personal assistant and wrote with the careful neutrality of someone trained to convey requests without editorializing. The message said that Ms. Hale would like to meet at a time and location of Elias's choosing, with no agenda other than a conversation. It said that if he declined, his decision would be respected without further contact. Elias read the message twice. Then he put his phone down and looked out his window at the gray mid-morning street below, and stayed there long enough that his coffee went cold. He replied. He named a diner 8 blocks from his apartment, the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that came in a pot left on the table. He gave a time. He did not add anything else. Victoria arrived first. She was sitting in a corner booth when he walked in, and she had come alone without Dana, without the quiet entourage that people of her position accumulated, without trying. She was wearing a plain dark coat, no visible jewelry, nothing that announced what she was. It was not a performance of humility, he could see that. It was something more effortful than that. It was a choice made carefully about how to enter a room that she had no right to control. She stood when she saw him. He told her to sit down. She did. They ordered coffee. The server left the pot. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Victoria put both hands flat on the table, not a gesture of supplication, but of steadiness, the way someone braces themselves before saying the thing they came to say. And she began. She told him she had kept working after he left, not to build a case, not to find a way to reframe what had happened into something more manageable, but because she needed to sit inside the full shape of it before she could say anything honest. What she now knew completely was his erasure had not been a side effect of her adoption. It had been the price of it. Arthur Hale had not simply acquired an heir. He had purchased a guarantee that the heir would never be complicated by a prior claim. That prior claim had been Elias, and the cost of eliminating it had been his life redirected before it had a chance to begin. Victoria said she had asked herself more than once what it meant to have spent her entire adult life expanding an empire whose first transaction had been a human being. Whether the company she had built, the employees she had hired, the decisions she had made, the person she had become, was something she could continue to stand inside once she understood what it was standing on. She said she did not have a clean answer to that question. She was not sure a clean answer existed, but she knew what the dishonest answer looked like, and she was not willing to live inside it anymore. Then she stopped talking about facts and records and financial structures. She looked at Elias directly and told him she was sorry. Not on behalf of Arthur Hale, not as a representative of the family, not in the language of corporate accountability. She told him she was sorry the way a person does when they understand that an apology cannot repair the specific damage done, but is still the only honest thing left to offer. She said she was sorry that someone had decided his life was worth less than her inheritance. She said she was sorry she had not known sooner, and she was sorry that knowing sooner might not have changed anything, and she was sorry she didn't know how to fix what couldn't be fixed. Elias looked at her for a long time. The diner moved around them. Cups refilled a couple two booths, over-arguing quietly about directions, the low noise of a Tuesday morning going about its business. He thought about the version of himself that had walked out of her office 3 weeks ago, full of something that had felt like clarity at the time. He thought about the years of careful solitary construction that had produced the man sitting in this booth, the specific discipline of needing no one, expecting nothing, building only what he could carry alone. He had been proud of that. He still was in a way. But he was also beginning to understand that pride and isolation could look identical from the inside, and that he had possibly spent a long time mistaking one for the other. He told her he didn't want her money. He said it plainly, not as an accusation, but because it was true, and she needed to hear it stated clearly. Victoria said she knew that. She said she wasn't there to offer it. He told her he didn't know what they were to each other, practically speaking, that biology was a fact, but a relationship was something you had to build, and that he didn't know if they were capable of building one on top of everything that was already there. Victoria said she didn't know either. She said she wasn't asking him to pretend. She was asking him whether he was willing to find out. He thought about what it had felt like to look across a ballroom and see his own face on someone else. Not the shock of it, he had processed the shock. He thought about what was underneath the shock, something he hadn't named until now, something that felt, if he was being honest, like recognition, like a door he hadn't known was closed. He told her he would try, not warmly, not with the language of reunion or resolution. He said it the way a practical man agrees to something that can't be guaranteed, carefully with his eyes open, knowing it might not work and choosing to attempt it anyway. Victoria nodded. She did not smile because she understood it wasn't a moment for smiling. She understood it was a beginning of something that had no script, and that the only way through it was to go through it. In the months that followed, Victoria began a quiet restructuring of the Hale Foundation. Not a public announcement, not a press cycle, but a shift in how the organization directed its resources, toward workforce development programs in the same under-resourced systems that had shaped Elias's life, toward legal support for people navigating the kind of institutional opacity that had buried his history. It was not penance. She was clear about that with herself. It was the answer to the question she had sat with for 3 weeks, what it meant to build forward honestly from an inheritance she had not chosen and could not return. Elias did not move into a bigger apartment or accept any financial arrangement. He kept his freelance work, kept his quiet life. But he started showing up at dinners that were strange and sometimes uncomfortable in conversations that had no established language for what they were. He and Victoria were not close in the way that people who grow up together are close. They were two fully formed strangers who happened to share an origin learning each other from the outside in. It was slow, it was sometimes awkward, it was real. There was an evening several months after the diner when they were sitting in her smaller office, the one across town, away from the staff, and they were not talking about anything important. She was working. He was reading. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet, when two people are comfortable enough to stop performing ease and simply exist. Elias looked up at some point and registered it not as a milestone or a conclusion, but as a simple fact of the present moment. He was not alone, for the first time in his life in a way that was real and documented and irreversible. He was not alone. He went back to his book. That was enough. There is a version of this story that ends with a press release, with a public reconciliation, a joint appearance, a headline about the billionaire and her long-lost brother. That version is cleaner. It is also false. What actually happened was quieter and harder and less resolved than any headline could contain. Two people sat across from each other in a diner on a Tuesday morning and agreed to try something that had no guarantee attached to it. One of them had spent her life building an empire. The other had spent his life building the discipline to need nothing. Neither of those things disappeared because they shared a face and a blood type and a sealed record in a county office somewhere. What changed was smaller than that and more permanent. Money can construct an empire floor by floor, acquisition by acquisition, until the structure is so large, it begins to look like it was always there, like it grew from something natural and clean. But it cannot reconstruct the years that were taken. It cannot sit in a room and simply be present. It cannot be the thing that makes a person feel for the first time that they are not entirely alone in the world. The truth that this story carries is not complicated. It is only difficult. What was taken from Elias Carter cannot be returned. What Victoria Hale inherited cannot be unwound. But between those two fixed points, there was still a choice about whether to face it honestly, about whether to build something real on top of something broken, about whether a relationship forged from loss could still be worth having. They decided it could. Not because it was easy, because it was true. And sometimes, that is the only reason that matters.